I met him when I wasn't looking for love, just kindness. His name was Dr. Andrew Pierce, and to everyone else, he was respectable, soft-spoken, and steady. To me, he was hope wrapped in a white coat. I was 64, a retired nurse who'd spent 40 years helping others heal, but I never realized how much of myself I had left unguarded. He told me I deserved a partner who understood sacrifice, someone who'd build a quiet life with me near the ocean. And when he talked about investments, about growing old without worry, I believed him. But people like Andrew don't take your trust all at once, they take it piece by piece. By the time I realized what he'd done, he was gone, and so was everything I'd saved. But I've learned something from my years in hospitals: you can't treat a wound until you expose it. And I was ready to start cutting back the lies. I remember the day I met Andrew as clear as I remember the sound of the sea outside my kitchen window. It was one of those early spring afternoons when the air feels gentle again after months of being sharp. I'd been invited to a medical charity luncheon in Norfolk, an event I almost didn't go to. I wasn't much for small talk anymore. After 40 years in nursing, most of my conversations had been with patients in pain or doctors too tired to notice much of anything. Retirement had given me quiet, but also a strange sort of loneliness. So when my old hospital supervisor called, saying they wanted veteran nurses to attend and share stories from the field, I thought, why not? Maybe it would feel good to be around familiar faces again. The hotel ballroom was polished and bright, with tables lined in white cloth and name tags waiting like promises. I took mine, Lydia Marshall, RN, retired, and pinned it just below my collarbone. I remember scanning the crowd, noticing the usual chatter among doctors, nurses, and donors. That's when I saw him, Andrew Pierce. He was standing near the coffee table, sleeves rolled up, talking to a group of volunteers. He wasn't loud or trying to draw attention, but somehow, people gravitated toward him. There was something easy about the way he spoke, direct but gentle, like someone who knew how to listen. He caught my eye for just a second, gave a small nod, and smiled. Not one of those polite, half-there smiles you give out of obligation. It was full, genuine, almost curious. I didn't think much of it at the time. I'd learned not to read into gestures. People are kind in passing, and that's just life. But later, during the luncheon, fate, or whatever you call it, had us seated at the same table. He introduced himself after the first course, saying he'd recently moved down from Richmond to start over. Family medicine, he said, his voice calm, low. I've been looking to set up something more personal, smaller scale, community-centered. Then he asked me about my work. Usually, that question brings polite nods or the classic "oh, I could never do what nurses do." But Andrew listened, really listened, when I spoke about night shifts, loss, and the small victories that no one writes down. His eyes didn't drift. They stayed on mine, steady and patient. We talked for over an hour. About the patients who stayed in your heart long after discharge. About the nights you didn't sleep because one face kept haunting you. He told me about his mother, how she passed after years of battling diabetes, and how he wished more people like me had cared for her. He said I reminded him of the kind of nurse who didn't just treat a chart, but a person. That stayed with me. It's been years since anyone saw me like that. After lunch, I went to fetch my coat, and he walked with me. Outside, the wind was gentle, carrying the faint smell of the bay. It was really good meeting you, Lydia, he said, smiling again, hands tucked in his coat pockets. People like you are why I still believe in medicine. And just like that, he was gone, walking down the steps, waving goodbye. I didn't think I'd see him again. But the following week, I got an email. Would you like to grab coffee sometime? I'd love to hear more about your time in the field. I smiled reading it. It had been years since someone had asked to hear my story, not out of politeness, but because they wanted to understand. We met at a small cafe by the marina, the kind of place that always smelled like cinnamon and old wood. The conversation picked up like no time had passed. He told me he'd been volunteering at a local clinic while getting his new practice in order. I shared how retirement hadn't been as restful as people said, how the quiet could sometimes feel heavy. He laughed softly and said, "You remind me of the nurses who used to keep me grounded. Maybe that's what I've been missing." That afternoon stretched into evening, and when the sun dipped low, I realized how easy it felt being around him. It wasn't romantic yet, not even close. It was something simpler, purer, connection. I'd spent so many years being the one people leaned on. For the first time in a long time, someone leaned in toward me. The weeks that followed were filled with small kindnesses. He'd drop by my porch with coffee if he was driving by. Sometimes we'd sit on the swing and talk about everything from healthcare reform to childhood dreams. He had this way of making ordinary things sound important. When he spoke about building something new, a clinic for the underserved, I saw that spark in his eyes, that same passion I'd once had for nursing before exhaustion dulled it. He told me he wanted to build a place where people didn't feel like numbers, a clinic where care came before cost. I believed him. He spoke with such conviction that it reminded me of why I'd gone into medicine in the first place. He said he'd been looking for someone with experience to help guide him through the community, someone who knew people, who understood what real service meant. I laughed and told him I was too old to start anything new. He shook his head, smiling. Maybe not new, he said. Just unfinished. After that, he started inviting me to planning meetings, informal ones at first. Just him, a few local donors, and me. I didn't have much to contribute financially, but he made me feel like my presence mattered. He'd ask my thoughts on patient flow, community outreach, even decor. You know what comfort looks like better than any of us, he'd say. And I'd smile, a little bashful, not realizing how much that approval meant to me. My daughter, Kelly, noticed. She'd call and tease me. "Mom, you sound like a teenager. Who is this doctor, really?" I'd brush her off, laughing. "He's just a friend, honey. We're working on something meaningful." Still, there was warmth in her teasing, maybe even relief that I was finding joy again. After losing my husband 7 years earlier, I'd become a shadow of myself. But Andrew made me laugh again, made me feel like my story wasn't over yet. I remember one evening particularly well. We were sitting on my porch again, a soft drizzle tapping against the railing. He'd brought soup from a local diner and 2 slices of pie. I teased him about his sweet tooth, and he said, "Life's too short to skip dessert." Then, quieter, "You know, Lydia, people like us, we've given so much of our lives to others. Maybe it's time we build something for ourselves." I didn't answer right away. The idea of us startled me, but in a gentle way. When I finally spoke, I said, "You mean, like a partnership?" He smiled, that same calm, reassuring smile. "Something like that." The rain slowed, and we sat in silence for a while, listening to the wind. It wasn't the kind of silence that feels awkward, it was full, comfortable. For the first time in years, I wasn't thinking about what I'd lost. I was thinking about what could still be built. Over the next month, we began meeting more often, breakfasts, planning sessions, community events. Everyone seemed to admire him. The way people looked at him, you'd think he was some kind of saint. I'd see neighbors wave, calling out, "Morning, Doc," and he'd smile and wave back, always kind, always composed. He had a way of making people trust him, not through words, but through presence. I suppose that's why I didn't question much. I'd always been good at reading people, but this time, I didn't want to. One Saturday afternoon, we attended a local health fair. I helped him set up his booth, handing out pamphlets and checking blood pressure for the elderly visitors. At one point, an older gentleman asked if the clinic was open yet. Andrew smiled, saying, "Not quite, but soon. We're working on the foundation." Then he turned to me, in front of everyone, and said, "Lydia's my partner in this. Couldn't do it without her." My heart swelled at that. Partner. Not assistant. Not volunteer. Partner. It wasn't about romance anymore, or maybe it was, but in a quiet way that didn't need to be said out loud. It was about purpose. About being needed again. That evening, he dropped me home, and before he left, he stood at the door for a moment, his hand on the frame. "You know," he said softly, "I've been thinking about something." I raised an eyebrow, smiling. "That sounds dangerous." He chuckled. "Maybe. But it's worth saying." Then, with a tone that felt both casual and deliberate, he added, "We should start a small clinic together, something for the community. You and me. You'd handle the care side, and I'll take care of the business." I remember my heart catching in my chest. For a moment, I saw it all: the rooms, the patients, the purpose. A second chance at doing what I loved. I didn't give him an answer right then. But when I closed the door that night and leaned against it, I found myself smiling in the dark. That was how it began. Not with grand gestures or red flags, but with gentle words and warmth. The kind that feels safe until you realize safety can be the softest kind of trap. And that was the last night I slept without worry. When Andrew first laid out the papers on my kitchen table, it felt like one of those small, careful moments you have when you're standing at the edge of something new and you want to be attentive. He had folders, neat, professional folders, and a soft pen he'd set down beside a printed business plan. There were letters of interest from a couple of local community groups, mock-ups of a logo that had his name on it, and copies of licensing documents that looked, to me at least, exactly like the sort of thing a responsible doctor would have. The whole display smelled faintly of coffee and new paper, and there was a kind of hopeful hush to the way he explained things, as if the future were an old friend he'd invited in. He explained the vision in a way that made sense to me. A small private clinic that cared for people who were often overlooked: the elderly, folks without easy access to healthcare, those who needed a steady hand and a familiar face. The plan had sections: outreach, staffing, affordable sliding scale fees, a modest capital budget. Andrew went over projected costs and a timeline, and he did it with that calm assurance he carried, like someone who had already solved the puzzle in his head and was excited to share the picture with you. He didn't rush me. He answered questions with patience. When I asked about malpractice insurance or where the equipment would come from, he gave specifics. When I asked about staffing, he mentioned a nurse manager he trusted and a couple of technicians he'd worked with before. Maybe what struck me most was that he wanted me there in a real role, not as a token, but as a partner. "You know the community," he said, folding his hands on the table. "You know who's falling between the cracks. I need that. We can build this together." He looked at me like someone asking for a teammate, not a favor. It's funny how a woman who spent decades making life-and-death decisions for others believes a soft voice and clear numbers. I think part of me wanted it to be true so badly that I leaned into the trust like a blanket on a cold night. Andrew showed me projected income statements and a cash flow sheet, and he explained how a modest investment now could support the clinic's first year. He talked about grants he was applying for and donors he had spoken to. He had letters of interest from a couple of small businesses that promised to refer employees, and an email from a local pharmacist saying they'd partner on discounted meds. It looked solid. When he suggested I invest a portion of my savings, he did it gently. "You don't have to." "Not at all," he said, eyes soft. "I asked because I think your involvement would send a strong message to the community. But I only want what you're comfortable with." He sounded like a man offering bread to someone at a table, not like a buyer asking for everything on the plate. He framed it as shared sacrifice, a way to bind us into the mission, and I suppose that language reached me. After years of caring for others, there's something in you that believes small sacrifices are what make projects real. I didn't give him everything. I was careful. I kept a portion of my savings tucked away, the kind you set aside so you won't be tempted to spend it on impulse. But I did decide to contribute a sum that, to me, felt reasonable enough to show commitment but not so much as to leave me exposed. I told myself if it was a bad idea, I'd learn from it and move on. I trusted him. I trusted his presence, his demeanor, and the way he always listened. There's power in that kind of trust. It makes you brave, sometimes too brave. In the weeks that followed, our lives began to thread together in a quiet, comfortable way. We met with potential donors at the coffee shop on the corner, sketched floor plans on napkins at the local diner, and took short drives to scout small storefronts that might serve as the clinic. When I suggested a layout that would make the waiting area less clinical, with comfortable chairs and a shelf of books, he applauded the idea, as if it were a brilliant stroke of design. "You always thought nurse first," he said with a smile, and I felt the old pride bloom in my chest. There were small, tender things, too. He'd leave flowers on my porch when he knew I'd had a hard day. He'd call after a shift and want to know what I had for dinner as if my appetite were a report worth noting. He did the kinds of little acts that, over time, braided themselves into something I hadn't expected to want again: companionship. We'd sit on the porch in the evenings and talk about patients who had stayed with us, the ones who made us cry and the ones who made us laugh. He told stories about his training, about nights in clinics where he learned how to calm people down with nothing but a steady voice. I shared my stories, the ones I'd never told anyone because they felt too vulnerable. He listened. It felt like coming home to a profession I loved but had set aside. There was this one afternoon that stayed with me. He took me to visit a small storefront that had been vacant for years, its windows dusty but its bones solid. "Imagine," he said, standing with his hands in his pockets, "a place where Mrs. Jenkins can get her blood pressure checked without driving across town. Where the kids down on Wilkes Street can see a doctor who knows their names." He pointed out where the exam rooms could be, where the small waiting area could have a corner for kids' books. He talked about hiring a part-time social worker, about holding workshops on diabetes management and fall prevention. His eyes were bright. He had charts and brochures, and he spoke of community as if it were something we could shape with our hands. I started to picture it, too. I saw a small sign on the door with our names. I saw the face of the clinic nurse warming a cup of tea for a worried spouse, the way I used to. I saw myself back in a place where my experience mattered in a practical way, not just as a memory. It felt like a second life, not in a dramatic way, but in a gentle, meaningful one. When you've spent your life putting others first, the chance to be needed again hums under your skin. The day he presented the final budget, I remember the slow way he set the last sheet down. He had a plan for equipment, a list of suppliers, and a breakdown of startup costs. He suggested a modest personal investment from me as a show of solidarity, not because he needed my money, he said, but because my participation would be an emblem of trust to the community and potential donors. He told me I'd be on the official paperwork as a founding partner. He used the word partner like it was a title to be proud of. I liked the sound of it. It felt like a life reclaimed. We signed some preliminary agreement papers that day, not as a formal legal contract but as a promise between two people who wanted to build something honest and useful. "This is exciting," Andrew said, and his smile was honest in a way that made my chest loosen. I remember thinking how rare it is at my age to have the pulse of possibility again, a plan that made sense and a partner who treated me like an equal. It felt good to be seen and believed in, to be asked to step into something rather than told to watch from the sidelines. There were moments of hesitation, of course. I called a friend from the old hospital, June, and talked through the numbers. June asked the questions a practical friend asks about liabilities and about whether the donor letters were verified. Andrew answered the questions calmly, provided contact info, and even offered to sit in on the call with June. He was transparent in a way that eased my doubts. I don't think I was gullible. I think I was ready to trust again, and that readiness made the vetting feel less urgent and more like a formality. One evening, after a long day of visiting potential suppliers, we sat on my porch and shared a bottle of inexpensive wine. There was a quiet, content rhythm to our talk. He raised his glass and I raised mine. "To a future built together," he said, and his voice was soft, steady, full of plans. We clinked glasses. I remember the look in his eyes as he said that, a look that made me feel like a companion in something worthy and durable. I tasted the wine. It was ordinary but sweet enough for the moment. I thought about the patients we might help, the people who'd finally have a doctor who cared. I thought about what it meant to be trusted and to trust in return. As the night settled, we sat quietly for a while, watching the distant lights blink on across the water. I felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the wine, a warmth of being part of a shared possibility. The house behind us hummed with the ordinary noises of home. I put my hand over his for a second, a small, private gesture that said more than words could. It felt natural then, the way a seam in a well-worn coat fits just right. For the first time in many seasons, I allowed myself to believe that the next chapter might be kinder than the last. And so, with that toast, a small investment, and a promise written in paper and in the air, we folded the plan into our lives. I helped him with the community outreach list, called an old colleague to see if they'd speak at our opening, and he, in turn, began taking on more of the logistical work. We both started referring to the clinic like it already existed in the world, the name of it spoken with affection and a touch of pride. It was easy then to imagine the day the sign would hang on the door, the day when people would come in and find someone who listened. I didn't see the cracks then. You don't always notice the first hairline fractures in a relationship or a plan. They're too small, too clever, blended into the promise like a slight lapse in a seam that you smooth over with hope. In those weeks, everything felt warm and purposeful. I thought I was stepping into a partnership that would heal others and, in a way, heal me too. We clinked our glasses again, to the clinic, to the future, to the quiet work of building something that mattered. I didn't know then that the groundwork for betrayal is sometimes laid under the very same hand that makes your tea. For a while, the small changes were easy to dismiss. He was busy, he said. Doctors always were. He'd been juggling volunteers, donors, and paperwork, and sometimes that meant late nights. I told myself the same things I tell patients when they come in worried: small problems have small answers. But the late nights turned into missed dinners and the text messages became fewer, then colder. Where there had been an easy rhythm to our days, coffee at 9, a walk after lunch, a call in the evening, there was now a distance I couldn't cross with a smile. It wasn't dramatic at first. He would cancel plans with an apologetic tone, blaming an emergency at the clinic or a meeting that ran long. "I'm sorry, Lydia," he'd say, voice soft and regretful. "I'll make it up to you." Once, he left his phone at my place by mistake, something I would have returned without a second thought. There were messages, quick, businesslike, to donors and a few family-like notes, nothing that gave me cause for worry. But the kindness of his early days felt like a memory, and every time his explanations landed like a feather instead of an anchor, I felt my footing slip a little. I began noticing small oddities. He'd take phone calls and step away from me, speaking in a lower tone so I couldn't catch the details. He started being vague about the clinic's progress. The storefront that we'd both admired one afternoon and planned together was now a line on a timeline. He mentioned travel, quick trips to meet potential suppliers, but when I asked for details, he'd deflect with a laugh or promise he'd show me the receipts later. I wanted to trust him. Part of me, the part that had spent decades caring for people and giving them the benefit of the doubt, wanted to see the best in him. But another part, the part that had learned to watch small signs in hospital rooms, was nudging me to pay attention. The first day I took the nudge seriously, I don't think Andrew realized that anything was wrong. He had left me a note: "Meeting today with a donor. I'll call after." It sounded ordinary. I decided, on a whim, to drive by the address he'd pointed out as the clinic's future home. I told myself I was being nosy, and I told myself I'd turn around if it looked strange. The lot he'd said had the storefront, the one with big windows that would catch the morning light, was an empty, sun-baked patch of earth. There wasn't even a concrete slab, nothing to suggest a plan or a permit had been pulled. If he'd told the truth about the place, there would at least be a sign, a for-lease notice, a board with a phone number. But the weeds nodded in the breeze and a lone piece of torn flyer fluttered on a fence post, advertising a yard sale from last summer. I sat there in my car a long while, watching dust move across the lot. My chest felt hollow in a way I hadn't felt since Tom's funeral, not raw so much as stunned. I thought of the plans we'd made at my kitchen table, the napkin sketches, the brochures he'd shown me. I thought of his steady voice telling me about donors and how my small investment would be seed money. I should have driven away then. Instead, I called Andrew. The phone rang. The calm, familiar voice that answered told me he was out of town, tied up with grant paperwork. "I'm so sorry, Lydia," he said. "Can we talk tonight?" I wanted to believe him. I told myself I was overreacting. At home that evening I sat down with my account ledger. I'd been keeping track of the little things for years, a habit from nursing where we charted everything, no detail too small. I opened my bank's online portal, fingers barely steady, and scanned the recent transactions. There, among the scheduled deposits and the grocery withdrawals, were transfers I'd expected to see: my pension deposit, a small monthly interest payment, the automatic transfer for my rent. And then, a piece of paper that stopped the breath in my throat, a series of withdrawals, wired transfers that left my account in rapid succession on the same day. I sat with the cursor blinking at me, the numbers abstract and cruel. I called the bank in the morning. The clerk on the phone was polite and used words that were meant to reassure, "Let's take a look together, Mrs. Marshall." She agreed to meet me in person. When I walked into the small branch, the sunlight made the tiled floor look clean and friendly. The woman behind the desk led me to a private booth and pulled up my account history. Her face shifted from professional to sympathetic as she scrolled. "These transfers were authorized online," she said. "They were made to accounts that our records show are linked overseas." The paper she handed me had transaction codes and bank routing numbers that sounded like foreign soil. I read the words twice, 3 times, as if repetition could change the meaning. The transfers weren't small. They were enough to knock the foundations out from under the little house of savings I'd built in the quiet years after Tom died. I felt ashamed in a way that surprised me. Shame is a private pain. It sits heavy in the chest and makes your voice small. I imagined people whispering, "How could a nurse, someone with experience and sense, be duped?" Maybe that's why I didn't call Andrew right away. I sat in my car after the bank, the engine off, and let the world move around me. The gulls screamed in the distance, the harbor boats swung lazily on their ropes. I tried to name my feelings: grief, embarrassment, cold fury, but naming didn't loosen them. The first person I called was Kelly. She answered with the bright voice of a woman trying to believe that everything would be okay. I told her, in halting sentences, what I'd found. Her gasp through the phone felt like a kind of alarm. "Mom, you need to come over," she said. "We'll figure this out." I didn't want the neighborhood to know. I didn't want to be that story on a table of afternoon tea, the old nurse who'd misplaced her judgment. I felt both foolish and stupidly proud that the world still trusted me for small things, and now I'd been tricked. But the nurse in me, the part that had learned to keep calm and measure things before panicking, pulled up a chair beside the wounded part. I remembered how in the emergency department we would size up a patient with a methodical list. What happened, when, what were the signs? This was no different. I took out a notebook and, with a hand that wouldn't have been steady in a panic, I began to write a timeline. I wrote the dates we'd met, the times he'd called, the day he'd shown me those donor letters, the afternoon I'd signed the small check. I wrote the dates of the bank transfers and the amounts beside them. My pen made certain sounds as it moved across paper, the kind of sounds you don't notice until you're using them to map an invisible thing. For a long time, I had been part of other people's charts and notes. Now I was writing my own. The act of recording made me less fragile. It took the raw, shapeless hurt and turned it into data I could work with. That evening I pulled out the folders Andrew had left with me, copies of business plans, emails he'd printed from donors, and the neat little logo sketches. I compared the dates on the printed emails to the dates on the bank transfers. Some matched. Others didn't. There were gaps. There were signatures that looked slightly different from the notes he'd scrawled in my notebook when we'd planned. I felt the old hospital-trained discomfort. Things that don't line up are usually a sign something's wrong. I called an old friend from the hospital, Nora, who now worked in medical administration. "Nora," I said, quietly, "I need you to look at this with me." She came the next day with a thermos of coffee and a calm I could borrow. She read the emails, squinted at the logos, and then set the pages side by side. "This reads like a professional plan," she said slowly. "But the correspondence is off. These don't look like official donor letters. And these account names, they're weird." She made a phone call and asked for a favor, someone who knows how to trace wire destinations. The kindness of a person who knows where to find answers is a kind of tenderness that steadies you. In the days that followed, I became a quiet investigator. I logged every call, saved every email, and made photocopies of every document. I learned the sound of my own resolve in the night when the house was quiet and the sea breathed against the shore. I set alarms on my phone for times he usually called, and I recorded the calls legally. I reminded myself, as a nurse trained to know the rules. I traced the donor names and found that some were people I'd met at the luncheon, and others were not. I started to see a pattern. Andrew moved in efficient, quiet waves, and when the light was on him, he was charming and convincing. When it was off, he vanished. People kept asking if I had confronted him. I didn't want to at first. Anger is hot and loud and it feeds the other person's ability to lie. I wanted a cleaner truth. If the clinic was a house of cards, I wanted to find the wind that made it wobble. So I recorded, I compared, I traced. I learned some new words, wire transfer codes, intermediary banks, offshore routing numbers. They sounded like a secret language for the people who think money is slippery and invisible. One night, tired and determined, I whispered into the dimmed kitchen, "You can't run from someone who knows how to trace what's hidden." It sounded like a small threat because it was coming from a small woman who had stitched wounds and soothed fevers and who had a ledger and a pen and steady hands. But it was a promise, too. The nurse inside me, the one who'd learned to follow a bleeding line to its source, was awake in a way I hadn't been in years. I folded the notebook closed and set it next to the phone. The next morning, I would call the numbers that might lead me to answers. I would ask questions that would make people uncomfortable. I would learn the language of accounts and transfers if I had to. For the first time since the transfers, the hurt in my chest felt like fuel for something practical. It didn't take revenge then. It took a kind of slow, steady unspooling, notes and phone calls, careful attention, small steps that would build into the next thing I needed to do. I placed the folder of documents on the kitchen table under a lamp and sat with them like a patient at the bedside, watching, waiting, readying. The house hummed quietly around me, the same house that had known Tom's laugh and our children's scribbles, and now, my quiet conviction. The world had tipped under my feet, but I could feel the ground again beneath my pen. I would follow the paper trail. I would let the small work I'd always done guide me now. When I decided I wasn't going to be a victim of a nice voice and a tidy suit, it felt less like righteous fury and more like coming back to a muscle I'd not used in years. Nursing teaches you to be methodical. You don't leap, you observe, chart, compare, and then act. So that's what I did. I went back to the work I knew, quiet, patient, and thorough. The first thing I did was call Nora. She'd been my colleague for years, running medical records and administration until she took early retirement to travel with her sister. Nora has a way of speaking that makes complicated things seem ordinary, and she doesn't panic. When I told her, simply and plainly, "I need your help tracing something," she didn't ask for melodrama. She said, "Pack a bag. I'll be there." That was the sort of steadiness I needed. By the time she arrived with a thermos and an extra notebook, I felt like the first page of the investigation could be written. We started where we always did in the hospital, by following the paper. The donor letters he'd shown me, the printed emails, the bank statements I'd photographed at the branch. Nora called a contact at the credit union where I had my account and asked what they could legally disclose to a customer who believed fraud had occurred. The woman on the line was helpful and precise. She told us which transfers could be frozen on an emergency basis and where to start with tracing intermediary banks. Those words, intermediary banks, sounded like something from a novel at first, but they were just pieces of a map. Next, I called June, who used to manage grants and community outreach at the old county hospital. June is the kind of person who remembers who promised what, where, and when. She tracked down the donor names Andrew had mentioned and made a few calls. Some of them were legitimate people who'd only ever heard of Andrew. Others were either non-existent or associated with different states entirely. That inconsistency pricked at me like a small, itchy worry that kept returning until you finally scratch it and it bleeds a little. While Nora and June did their part, I dug into the less glamorous but very useful public records. I discovered that there are ways to trace business registrations without being a detective. Clinic names, assumed business names, and professional licenses are often matters of public record. I taught myself to navigate a dozen different government sites, the state medical board, the county clerk's office, local business registries. It's funny how comfortable I felt doing that. There's a rhythm to looking up a license number, checking expiration dates, scanning for inconsistencies. Andrew's name turned up in one place under Andrew Pierce, MD, with a license that appeared valid. In another place, I found a similar name but with a middle initial changed. In a third, an entirely different surname used in a different state. Patterns emerged, changes in the way his name was presented, slightly different addresses, and clinic listings that seemed to appear overnight and vanish just as quickly. Nora had an idea that proved useful. She'd worked long enough to know people who could pull archived web pages and domain registrations. She asked a friend to check the clinic websites Andrew had used. What we found were sites that looked professional, contact forms, staff bias, photos, but when we checked the domain registration dates, some of the sites had only been live for a few weeks before being taken down. The biographies were thin, and the about pages felt like placeholders. Some of the photos were stock images. There was an artful speed to the way these sites were assembled and then abandoned. It was as if someone were building illusions instead of institutions. I started compiling everything into a single binder. The nurse in me had to see truth in front of me, lined up and labeled. One section was his communications, emails, texts, the printed pages of donor letters. Another section was the bank details. Then I added a timeline, written in my neat, ordered script, the dates he'd been distant, the dates I'd given money, the dates the transfers had cleared. Laying it out that way made the story less like a private grief and more like a case. Once I had a working timeline, I reached out to a few people who possibly had been in Andrew's orbit in other places. I was careful. One doesn't simply say, "Has this man ripped you off?" and expect kindness. Instead, I asked questions like a nurse asking about symptoms, gentle and precise. "Has a Dr. Pierce ever worked at your clinic? Did you ever get a donation inquiry from him?" It turned out that, in Georgia, a woman named Carol remembered a Dr. Pierce who'd been at a small wellness center for less than a year. She described him differently than the warm person I'd met. She said he didn't stay long and that there had been paperwork issues. Carol sounded apologetic when she said it, as if she'd just realized something she'd seen as odd before was actually worrisome. Piece by piece, a pattern became clearer. The same man, or variations of the same name, moved through clinics and communities, always presenting as a professional with good intentions. The difference was in the paperwork and the accounts. Where a legitimate project would build slowly, with a town's notice and a permit on the door, these projects appeared with the speed of a gust of wind, settling, and then when attention focused on them, they were gone. He seemed to prefer the margins, where someone could say, "We're building," and people would nod and trust. There's a tender cruelty to the way he chose his marks. Widows and retirees, people who remembered being listened to in a cold world, those were the ones he found. They trusted his uniform and his soft, professional language. When you've spent a life in service, someone who understands the language of care can slip under your defenses. I found myself both chastising my naive heart and admiring the cunning that had respected no ethics at all. As I collected names and stories, the emotional arc of my own recovery shifted. Shame remained like a bruise, but it stopped dominating every thought. In its place steadied something cooler, strategy. I began writing carefully worded letters to the people who'd been touched by him, not accusatory but factual. "I am Lydia Marshall. I believe we share an association with a Dr. Andrew Pierce. I found discrepancies in public records and wanted to ask if you had any documentation about clinic registrations, donor correspondence, or staff names." Some people ignored me. Others answered with short, stunned notes. One woman in Ohio sent a scanned copy of a check made out to a Shell clinic and said she'd been instructed to transport supplies and never saw receipts. Another, from Florida, sent a printout of an email requesting a charitable write-off. It was humbling and heartening in equal measure to have strangers let me into their vulnerability. I also learned to lean on the law in ways I'd once considered only for television dramas. Nora's administrative instincts led us to a retired attorney she knew, Tom, who had once done pro bono work for the hospital. He was cautious and precise. When I explained what I had assembled, he didn't make promises he couldn't keep. He said, "These are pieces. We can approach this civilly, first. We can seek account freezes and ask banks to trace funds. We can bring this to a state medical board and ask them to look at license irregularities. But we must do it in order." It was the kind of sober roadmap I needed. Tom also suggested we quietly reach out to a handful of other potential victims to see if they would be willing to cooperate. "There is protection in numbers," he said. "Predators like this thrive on isolation." While the legal route took shape, I took to driving. There's a certain clarity that comes from being present in a place. I drove to towns where the websites had suggested clinics and sat in my car across from their addresses. Sometimes there was a small, well-loved clinic. Sometimes there was a completely unrelated business. Once, there was a modest building with a hand-painted sign. No one I spoke to remembered a Dr. Pierce. Once, in a strip of storefronts in a Georgia town, I found a place with a name resembling the one on his latest website. There was a small garden and a waiting room with a stack of outdated magazines. No plaque, no permit on the door, just a homey atmosphere and a receptionist who answered with a practiced, polite distance. I introduced myself as an interested potential donor the way a nurse checks a patient's vitals, with calm professionalism and no hint of alarm. I learned, in those waiting rooms and over small-town coffees, that people often sense but do not want to name wrongs until someone else gives them permission to speak. A woman in the clinic's hallway mentioned they'd had trouble with bookkeeping and that the doctor had left suddenly. A former employee texted me, from a number she gave in private, telling me she'd been asked to sign things she didn't understand and had left because her conscience wouldn't let her continue. By then, my husband's quiet, practical voice, Tom's memory, felt like a companion at my shoulder. He'd always said that doctors and nurses are human, some are saints, some are not. You learn the difference by watching what they do when no one's looking. I was watching now. I had the location. I had the name he was using now, slightly altered. I had a pile of paper and a growing group of people who had been affected. I had a retired attorney willing to help if we moved correctly. And I had a plan that didn't include storming his office or calling the police in a flurry. If this man had preyed on those who trusted, then exposing him required something careful, precise, and undeniable. I wanted him to be confronted not with the sharpness of anger but with the cool clarity of proof. So I did not call the police that day when I stood outside the clinic in Georgia. I did not march in and demand justice with a raging voice. Instead, I sat in my car for a long time, watching the door. I wrote a list, evidence to show, people to contact, the order in which to contact them. I would assemble the documents that left no room for his charm to wiggle out of facts, bank transfers, matching email dates, witness statements, the discrepancies in his licensing, copies of the websites and their registration dates, the names of people who could corroborate the pattern. I would build a wall of paper so solid that his apologies would be like trying to mend a dam with a handkerchief. That night I phoned Kelly and told her quietly, I found where he's been operating. I'll go there, but not yet. I want to do this one right. She was worried, of course, and wanted to come. I told her no, not because I didn't want her, but because a presence that looked like a hurt daughter might be misread by others and endanger the case. I wanted this to be about truth, not spectacle. I slept badly that night, not out of fear but from the hum of my own planning mind. I thought about the way he'd looked at me when we toasted, so sincere, so convincing. I thought about the women who'd trusted him like I had, and how their trust had been used as currency. But under those thoughts there was a practical, almost gentle resolve. The same part of me that had been patient with a frightened patient in the middle of the night, the one who'd learned to calm a room down with a whisper and a check of vitals, was now focused and alert. I paused at the door, looking back at him. He was trembling slightly, staring at the folder as if it might grow heavier by the second. The man who had spent years manipulating others now looked cornered by the quietness he had once mistaken for weakness. You'll be hearing from my attorney soon, I said. And from the women you hurt. Maybe even the licensing board. But before all that, I wanted to look you in the eye so you'd know it was me who finally turned the light on. He didn't answer. His hands covered his face now, his shoulders hunched. A soft sound escaped him, not quite a sob, not quite speech. I didn't stay to hear it. I walked out, my step steady, my heart neither racing nor cold. Just calm. When I reached my car, I sat for a moment, letting the air from the open window wash over me. The world outside looked the same, cars passing, a mother holding her child's hand, a couple arguing softly over directions, but something inside me had shifted. I had come full circle. I wasn't the trusting woman who handed over her savings with faith in someone else's promise. I was the woman who learned how to turn her pain into evidence and her silence into strength. As I started the car, I caught a glimpse of the clinic's reflection in the rearview mirror. The sign looked smaller now, less certain. I knew that by the time the week was out, it wouldn't be there at all. People like Andrew always think they're too clever to be caught until someone with patience and purpose walks in, folder in hand. And as I drove away, I didn't feel victory or vengeance. Just peace. A deep, earned quiet that filled the space where humiliation had once lived. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't running from anything, I was simply moving forward. I didn't look back again. I didn't need to. The sea outside my window is calm again. It's funny how, after everything, the quiet feels like a luxury. The waves roll in steady, patient, like they've been doing long before I was born and will keep on long after I'm gone. I sit here most mornings now, wrapped in my soft blue shawl, with a cup of tea cooling beside me. The house is mine again, every inch of it. Every creak in the wood floor, every faded photo on the mantel. It's small, humble, but it's mine, and it holds peace in a way that I never realized mattered so much until I lost it. The legal part took months. Papers, signatures, statements, hearings, it all moved slower than I wanted it to. But every time I started to lose patience, I'd remind myself, slow doesn't mean weak. It just means deliberate. And that's what justice became for me, deliberate. There were moments when I thought about walking away, when I thought maybe it wasn't worth dragging everything through the courts. But each time, I'd picture the women who'd written me those trembling letters. I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore, I was fighting for all of them too, the ones who'd trusted someone and ended up paying for it. When the judgment finally came down, I didn't cry. I thought I might, but I didn't. The court called it financial restitution and professional misconduct. I called it the truth finally written down somewhere official. He was barred from practicing, and his accounts were frozen. I got back most of what he took, not all, but enough. Enough to keep my home, to breathe again without feeling the pinch of loss every time I opened a bill. But what meant more than the money was the part that couldn't be measured, seeing his name printed under the words revoked license. The press caught the story eventually. A quiet local journalist reached out after the hearing, a woman my age with kind eyes and a recorder that clicked softly when she asked her questions. I didn't want the drama, but I told her the truth. She promised to write it with respect. And she did. The article wasn't sensational. It didn't paint me as a victim or him as a monster, just two people on opposite sides of trust. It spread farther than I expected, though. A few weeks later, I started getting letters and emails from other women. Some said thank you. Some said you helped me see the signs. And some just said, I'm so sorry you went through that, but I'm proud of you. I kept every letter. They're in a box by my chair, a collection of proof that speaking up, even quietly, matters. I didn't stop being a nurse when I retired, I just stopped wearing the uniform. So when a friend at the community center asked if I'd volunteer at a free clinic again, I said yes. My hands still know what to do. I can still take blood pressure, listen, comfort, guide. But this time, I do something a little different too. Once a week, I sit with a small group of older women, and we talk not just about health, but about trust. I show them how to check their financial accounts, how to verify a charity, how to read a contract before signing. It's not a lecture. It's a conversation, the kind that says, you're not foolish for believing in people, you're human. But you can be wiser now, too. There's a woman named Irene who comes every Thursday. She reminds me a little of who I was before all this, generous, gentle, always looking for the good in everyone. She told me once, I never thought people like that could find someone like me. I smiled and said, they find the kind ones first. That's their mistake. That's the thing about healing. It doesn't happen all at once. It happens in layers, like the tide washing over sand, smoothing what's rough a little at a time. There are still mornings I wake up and think about the day I found out. The shame still whispers sometimes, but it doesn't sting anymore. It's just a memory now, folded and put away neatly. Sometimes, in the evenings, I'll walk down to the water with a blanket and just listen. The wind off the ocean feels like forgiveness, not for him, but for me. For the part of me that once thought love had to be proven with sacrifice. I realize now that the people who truly care for you never ask for the things that cost you your peace. Kelly visits often. She worries less now, but she still brings groceries and fusses over the loose railing on the porch. I let her. It's her way of showing love. We don't talk about him much anymore, but every now and then, she'll look at me and say, you did good, Mom. And that's enough. One afternoon, a few weeks ago, I received a letter from someone I didn't expect, another woman who had been part of his charity circle years before me. She'd seen my story online and wrote, "I thought he'd broken me, but you reminded me that strength can sound quiet." I sat with that letter a long time, tracing the words with my finger. It made me realize that my story, my quiet, steady kind of revenge, wasn't really about getting even. It was about reminding people that being broken isn't the end of your story. The house feels different now. It's lighter. I rearranged the furniture, repainted the living room, and replaced the old drapes with soft linen ones that let in the sunlight. I even planted herbs on the windowsill, rosemary, basil, and thyme. When I cook, the smell fills the kitchen, and it reminds me of life before the storm. I've learned that peace has a scent, and it smells a lot like home-cooked soup and ocean air. The women at the clinic call me Miss Lydia. They say I have the calmest voice in the room. Maybe that's what happens after you've walked through fire, your tone softens because you've already seen how loud pain can be. One of the younger volunteers, barely 30, told me once, "You don't seem angry, after everything." I smiled and said, "I was, for a while. But anger burns too fast. I needed something that lasts longer, like peace." That word, peace, has become my cure. It's what I wake up grateful for every morning, what I fold into my prayers before bed. Peace doesn't erase what happened, but it rewrites it. It turns what used to hurt into a kind of quiet wisdom. I don't need him to pay anymore. Life already did that for me. Losing everything he built was punishment enough. When I look at my reflection now, I don't see a fool. I see a woman who loved, trusted, fell, and got back up. Stronger, wiser, and softer all at once. There's a power in that combination, the kind of power that doesn't shout but steadies the air around it. I used to think revenge was payback, the kind that comes with fire and fury, the kind you see in movies or read about in headlines. But it's not. It's peace. It's sitting by a window in the home you reclaimed, knowing you'll never be that blind again. It's helping others so they don't have to fall the same way you did. It's the quiet satisfaction of knowing you didn't just survive, you healed. The sunlight hits my hands as I write this. They've done a lot of work in their time, stitching wounds, holding hands, signing papers, letting go of things that no longer deserved their touch. Now they rest, steady and sure. I can almost hear Tom's voice in my mind, that deep, gentle humor that used to fill this house. "You did good, LYD. You did real good." I smile, just slightly. The tea beside me has gone cold, but I don't mind. The air smells like salt and rosemary, and the gulls are calling somewhere beyond the dunes. The day feels full, like it's holding its breath before sunset. And as I sit here, I think maybe the cure for betrayal isn't revenge or closure. Maybe it's simply finding yourself again, piece by piece, in the light of your own truth. If you've listened this far, thank you. And if you've ever trusted someone and been hurt for it, I hope my story reminds you of one thing: you can still come back stronger. You can still find your peace. If my story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, or subscribe. There are more stories about love, loss, and quiet justice waiting to be told. Until next time, this is Lydia, smiling, steady, and finally healed.